Hey everybody! Welcome to the third and final part of the short series on the Saturn V Mod 410 Remote Digital Multiplexer. Last time, we took a look at the timing cards and the counter cards, and also almost had our day ruined by a diode yet again. This time, we're going to look at all the rest of the cards and put it all back together. So, with no further ado, let's get into it. Next up, we have the Patch B and Patch C cards, which are actually connected together in a surprisingly janky way for high vibration flight hardware, using these little stakes here. Let me pull this apart. So this is what we have. Patch B is on the left and Patch C is on the right. I was very confused when I first did the restoration as to why there was no Patch A, but that's because Patch A is in the PCM. The Patch B card is shared between the PCM and the Mod 410. But Patch C is specific to the Mod 410, and Patch A is specific to the PCM. So what this card does, this is how you program a Mod 410. This Patch B card has all of the drive circuitry and interface logic and everything that connects to the MCRs. And will tell each of them when to write and when to read. The Patch C card is basically a diode matrix that you manufacture that makes a combination of all of the 5 counter and 6 counter and 3 counter and 10 counter outputs and combines those with the read and write clocks and passes that information along to our Patch B card, which routes them out to the appropriate MCRs. So when you want to program the Mod 410, when you want to change the timing of its reads or writes, you have to manufacture a new Patch C card. And fill it in with a bunch of diodes, and then apparently encapsulate the whole damn thing. And then you have a newly reprogrammed Mod 410. I had thought originally when I first got this box that the programming was going to be done externally via a harness. I thought that's what the big connectors on the back were going to be. But no such luck. You have to actually make a whole new board if you want to reprogram it. Alright, I've put the patch cards in and have wired up all of the MCR write outputs from them. So let's get it turned on. So I'm quite zoomed in. I have the Group A clock on top and the 4 pulse per second reset. And we can see that the MCR1 write is actually happening basically the last clock before a reset comes in, which is interesting. But we're gonna have to zoom way out to see all of the other MCR commands. And let me put a 200 millisecond delay on this. Okay, so reset comes in here. The MCR1 write pulse happens just before it, as we saw. And then it looks like we write in order 1, 4, 7, 10, 3, 6, 9, 2, 5, 8, and then we wrap back around. All 10 of the MCR writes seem to be evenly spaced by, what do we have, 50 milliseconds per div? So they're all evenly spaced by 25 milliseconds, which makes sense because 1 4 pulse per second period is 250 milliseconds, and we're dividing it into 10 frames, 1 for each MCR. So 25 milliseconds in between each write makes absolutely perfect sense if they want to be, basically evenly spreading out the writes. The pattern that they've picked here is interesting. I'm not sure why, or if there is a reason really other than this is just what they went with. But anyways, I don't have enough channels to show all the reads at the same time, so what I'm going to do is move all of my test points over to the read pins on the MCRs, and I guess I'll take a screenshot of the writes and the reads and then overlay them in GIMP or something. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll take a look at what the full program that they made for this this Mod 410 is. Alright, I've wired up the read pulses coming out of the patch cards, and they look basically identical to the write pulses. It's the same pattern, 1, 4, 7, 10, 3, 6, 9, 2, 5, 8, evenly spread out. They're so close together that my idea of doing an overlay of screenshots doesn't work because the resolution of the scope isn't sufficient. Like, the screen resolution isn't sufficient when I have the full thing on the screen. These just kind of look like they're in the same spot, even though I think they're not. So if we zoom in on MCR1 here, you can see that the pulse is now, the read pulse is aligned with the 4 pulse per second sync instead of being slightly before it. So it's delayed by 1 clock cycle, basically. And then there's a little glitch there, which is interesting. But that's what I suspect is happening all over the place. I think that all of these are basically just delayed by 1 clock cycle. And I don't really feel like mapping the whole thing out in this way. So instead what I'm going to do is something that I should have done before I put in the patch cards, is I'm gonna map out the diode matrix. And we're going to look at exactly what diodes they have installed for each of these things, because I'd kind of like to know, if I wanted to make a replacement patch, what I would have to do, where I would have to put those diodes anyways. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pull the cards back out and map out the diodes, and then we'll map out exactly what this program is in a spreadsheet instead of trying to do it with a screenshot. Alright, so here's the deal. I pulled out the patch cards, tested all the diodes, mapped out the write and read timing for the whole box. I understand what they did now. I'll show you a spreadsheet in just a second that shows essentially what diodes they have selected and what times those ended up being. But what I've learned a few things. Channel 1 is different in this box. It is the only one where the diode selection for the write time and the read time are different. And for all channels except for channel 1, the diode selection is the same for write and read. So let me show you what I'm looking at here. Confirm in hardware, I guess, while running what I'm seeing from the diodes. Okay, so what do we have here? We have our group A clock, external 4 pulse per second reset. I have added the 7200 pulse per second read clock that we looked at the very beginning. The thing is, the patch cards actually AND together the diode selection with the write clock, but they don't do it for the read clock. For whatever reason, the read clock gets routed to every single MCR, and it's on the MCR that the ANDing with the diode selection happens with the read clock. So, channel 1, our write pulse, which is already ANDed with the write clock, happens before the reset. This is at the very end, like the last possible clock of the entire 4 Hertz cycle. We have the write pulse. And then the read pulse, because it has not been ANDed with the read clock, is much wider. This is just a combination of our diode clocks. So when MCR1 sees the read clock in combination with the read output for this MCR from the patch, that right there is when the read happens. There's also this little glitch here. It seems to happen with most MCRs. It doesn't matter because it doesn't align with a read clock, so the MCR isn't going to do anything. Alright, so this is channel 1. We have our write pulse, and then the read happens 1 clock cycle later than the write happened. So on to MCR2, I'm going to change my trigger to go to digital 5. Now, now you can see that the write pulse output from the patch and the read output from the patch are right on top of each other. They have the exact same diode selection, and the only reason why this works is that the read clock comes very slightly after the write clock, which was used to generate this pulse. And this is what all of the MCRs except for channel 1 look like. The read and the write happen in the same clock cycle, and it's all basically evenly spaced. So, not the most interesting possible program for a Mod 410, but I understand what's happening now. We have the timing for this specific unit all mapped out, and I'll show you on the spreadsheet what exactly that looks like. And also why the pattern that we saw earlier, the 1, 4, 7, 10, etc., why that looks the way it does. All right, here's the spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is what made the whole counter architecture of the Mod 410 finally click in my head. And hopefully, unless you got there faster than I did, hopefully it does the same thing for you. So how this works. We know that the Mod 410 takes in a 3600 Hz clock and a 4 pulse per second frame sync. That means that each frame has 900 clocks. And so the spreadsheet has 900 rows, with each row corresponding to one of those 900 clocks. The columns of the spreadsheet correspond to specific phases of specific counters. The thick vertical lines separate the different counters, and wherever there's a green 1 in a cell, that means that that phase of that counter is active during the specified clock. Okay, so how does the Mod 410 use these counters? So we know that it advances the 6 counter and the 5 counter once during each clock. The trick is that because 5 and 6 are co-prime, the pair of values that those counters take on won't repeat until their least common multiple, which is 30. So for example, during clock 0, the 6 counter has a value of 1, the 5 counter has a value of 1. And so you won't find that combination happen again until 30 clocks have gone by. On the 30th clock, you'll get a repeat of that pair. And the same goes for any pair of values you see up here. Every single one of these rows is unique, and it doesn't repeat until 30 clocks later. That's why the 3 counter and the 10 counter then advance on the 30th clock. Because now, with these two having advanced, you still have a globally unique value for the counters at this point. This combination of 4 counters has not appeared yet previously in the spreadsheet. But 3 and 10 are also co-prime, which means that the pair of values that they take on won't repeat until their least common multiple, which is also 30. And 30 times 30 is 900. And so by that logic, every single row of this spreadsheet is unique. But we also know that 5 times 6 times 3 times 10 is also 900. So not only is every row of this spreadsheet unique, but also it's fully exhaustive. We have every single possible combination of the counters represented here. That means that every single possible combination of 4 counter values uniquely specifies one of the 900 clock cycles in a frame. And so, if you want to program a Mod 410, basically what you do is you pick out the clock cycles that you want each MCR to write in and which you want it to read in, and then you look up those clock cycles in this spreadsheet, determine which phases you need for each of the 4 counters, and then install diodes on your patch C card corresponding to those 4 phases. That will basically construct an AND gate. And so, for example, if we wanted to specify clock number 876 for an action, we would need a diode for 52, 61, 33, and 1010. And that AND gate would only pulse during clock number 876. So over on the right, I have what all of the diodes installed in my Mod 410 are. And next to that, I have listed out what the specific counter phases that those diodes correspond to are. And there's a very, very clear pattern that you can see here with the 3 counter and the 6 counter and the 5 counter, which is that with the exception of our MCR1 write, which we knew was weird, every single possible action uses the first phase of the 3 counter, the first phase of the 6 counter, and the first phase of the 5 counter. The interesting thing that they did is that every MCR uses the phase of the 10 counter that corresponds to its MCR number. So MCR2, for both its write and its read, uses phase 2 of the 10 counter. MCR3 uses phase 3, MCR7 uses phase 7, and so on and so forth. The reason why that's really interesting is because doing it that way directly leads to the order of MCR writes and reads that we saw on the oscilloscope. So let's scroll up in the spreadsheet over here. The first time we see the first phase of the 3, 6, and 5 counters is on clock number 0, at which point the 10 counter is also on its first phase. That corresponds to the MCR1 read, which is what we saw. But if we scroll forward 90 clocks to reach the next time the 3, 6, and 5 counters are all on their first phase, the 10 counter is now on 4. If we go forward another 90 clocks, the 10 counter is now on 7 when the 3, 6, and 5 counters are all on 1. And so it's in this manner that the 1, 4, 7, 10, etc. pattern that we saw in the oscilloscope arises. It's just because they tied the MCR number to the 10 counter phase number. And then at the very bottom, clock number 899 has 1010, 33, 66, and 55. This is the last clock before we get another frame sync. All 4 of the counters are on their last possible count. And indeed, as we would expect, that is the diode combination that MCR1 write has programmed into it. And so basically everything that we're seeing in hardware makes sense. It all lines up. We can explain the order of the pulses. We can explain basically everything we're seeing. Okay, let's get out of spreadsheet land and back to looking at interesting hardware. Sorry for the long spreadsheet diversion. We're finally onto the main star of the Mod 410, the Magnetic Core Register, or MCR. This thing has 10 bits of core memory and all of the power and all of the drivers and everything needed to write and read it. So, looking at this board, this little chip up here actually has the 10 bits of core in it, and then each of these are capable of driving writes into those 10 cores. We also have a little power supply and some diodes on the sense lines going out. There's also optional Zener diodes that can be installed on the inputs, depending on their levels. This MCR does not have Zener diodes installed, it has straps instead. The MCRs in this specific Mod 410 are quite a motley crew. This one that I'm showing you here is pretty standard as far as MCRs go, but I'll show some of the variations as well. So this one is the same configuration as the first one. It's just green instead of kind of brown, which is interesting. It's the only card that's this color in the whole box. This one actually does have the Zener diodes installed on its inputs, so the levels that this card was handling are different than all of the other cards. And last but not least, when I learned that MCR0 is handled differently than all of the other ones. I instantly knew which one it was going to be. And sure enough, this is MCR1. This one used to have Zener diodes installed, but they've been brutally hacked out, and then all of the inputs have been shorted to a single pin. So that one pin is going to set all 10 cores or unset all 10 cores, depending on its level. This is by far the worst rework, the hackiest hack I've seen in Apollo hardware. It's kind of fascinating. Anyways, I'm probably going to test with this one because of that feature of I only have to set one input bit to affect all 10 cores. So I'm going to put this one in first, MCR number 1, and then we'll see what it does. Surprise! Before we actually turn on the Mod 410 with an MCR installed, we're actually going to talk about the final card, the PSR, or Parallel Storage Register. The reason is that I've realized, having tried it now, that the PSR is going to add termination for the sense lines coming out of the MCRs, which are currently floating. And so without this installed, we're not going to see a lot interesting on the sense lines. So anyways, PSR, Parallel Storage Register. Very straightforward card. It has 10 flip-flops, each of which stores a single bit. The reason you need it is that when the cores flip, they put out a little tiny voltage blip, very brief. And so these flip-flops will latch that blip effectively and persist it until the next PSR clear pulse comes from the timing cards. So this both, latches, it sort of performs the action of a sense amplifier by grabbing the little voltage blip and making it a big output, and also latches the outputs so that they stick around long enough for the PCM to read them. So let's get this card installed, and then we'll have all of the cards except for 9 of the MCRs in. Okay, the MCR and the PSR are installed in the Mod 410. It's very close to complete now. All of these empty slots are just more MCRs. I've added some leads to test the output of this MCR, so we can hopefully see some cores flipping. I've also, back here, tapped into one of the input pins and its return on the connectors on the back. I have not built a harness for those. It's 110 wires. I don't know if I'm gonna do it. I'm not really feeling it at the moment. But let's get this thing fired up with the MCR and the PSR in place and see what we can see as far as flipping cores go. Alright, let's get this thing fired up. Power and clocks. So we're down to only 2 digital channels, the Group A clock and the external 4 pulse per second reset. I've also added this analog channel, which is showing the sense line for bit 1. We only have one MCR plugged into it, so it's basically just the sense line from bit 1, core 1 of MCR 1, but this is a shared sense line that goes to all of the MCRs. So what I'm going to do is apply voltage to an input pin on the back. I'm going to start with 1 volt, and then just sort of creep it up until we see the MCR respond to it. 2 volts, 2.5, 2.6. So starting to see a little bit of activity there. 2.8, 2.9, 3 volts. Okay, so it looks like 2.8 to 2.9 is about the threshold level for the MCR. So let's take a look at this. So during write time, which if you remember happens for MCR1, the clock cycle before the external reset, during write time we're getting a pulse down out of the core, which is, let's see, we're on 2 volts per div, so it's like 2.4 volts down. And then at read time, we're getting a huge jump. It's just over 6 volts, which is a hell of a kick out of that core. I have to imagine that these are tape-wound cores and not little ferrites. So let's change the trigger here and zoom in on these little voltage spikes out of the core. So starting with the right pulse, very classic core output waveform when it's changing its polarity. And for the, let's stay zoomed in. For the, oh man, here we go. Move the trigger up. For the right pulse, you can see it's much more deformed because we're driving the core a lot harder for read than we are for write, which means that basically you're going to get a much bigger voltage spike out of the core, but it's going to be less clean. But it's giving 6 volts, which is pretty crazy for a magnetic core being used as memory. You know, usually cores are going to give you on the order of tens to hundreds of millivolts. So this is a big kick. And it's worth noting that this box doesn't contain any sense amplifiers, which you usually have when you're dealing with core memory. The sense amplifiers do 2 things for you, right? They boost the 10 to 100 millivolt voltage spikes up to a usable level, but they also correct for the polarity. When you're dealing with regular core memory, usually you don't know if, when you read a core, if the voltage spike is going to go up or down. It's not to say that that's random, it's actually deterministic. It just depends on how the core plane was wired. And if you were trying to enforce it such that all reads gave you positive voltages, the wiring would become dramatically more complicated. And so to simplify it, they make the sense amplifier sense both positive and negative spikes, and then the manufacturing process for the core plane is so much simpler. But when you're only dealing with 10 cores, you can imply that restriction. So every core in every MCR is going to give a downward blip when it is written to, and an upward blip when it's read from. And this is so big and sufficiently wide that it just goes straight into the flip-flop on the PSR. There's no sense amplification going on anywhere here. They're just running the output of this core directly into that flip-flop, and it works. So, last thing to do here is to wire into the outputs. We finally made it to the output connector. Wire up to the output connector on the box and see what the PSR is doing in response to these cores flipping, which should be happening because of the MCR that I'm using. Should be happening on all 10 output bits. So I'll get a harness and be right back. And here's the harness that I built for the outputs. It has all 10 bits and a return, so I'm going to get this plugged in. And we'll take a look at what it's doing. Okay, I have all 10 outputs wired up. Let's turn it on. So with the input pin low, we're getting nothing on any of the outputs. If I take it high, we get something on all 10 outputs, which is great. That means basically that all 10 cores in this MCR and all 10 flip-flops in the PSR are working correctly. And sort of just as we would expect from the 7200 pulse per second clear signal that gets sent to the PSR, the output only lasts for half of a clock period. So that makes perfect sense. One thing I am curious about is if we kind of slowly drop the voltage on the input pin, because there was sort of that intermediate state where the output kicks from the core were smaller, I wonder if some of the cores behave differently. So I'm going to drop this down bit by bit and see if all of them drop out at the same time, or if there's a level at which, yeah, look at that. So core 1 actually drops out before all of the others. Okay. So core 1 drops out, let's see here. Core 1 drops out between 2.8 and 2.9 volts. And then most of the others hang on until 2.7 volts, but if I go down to 2.6 volts, then we only have 4 cores left, and below that, this is 2.5 volts, nobody is triggering. So it seems like you definitely want probably at least 3 volts to be registered as a 1 instead of a 0, which makes sense. I think most of these signals were 0 to 5 volts, so should be plenty of margin there, but it's not quite evenly split down the middle. Anyways, that's a basically fully functional Mod 410, except for all of the other MCRs that I haven't tested. So I'm going to just go ahead and throw the rest of those into the box, and then we'll do one final test, maybe plumb another bit or two into some other MCRs, just to see the multiplexing happening. But that's about it. Alright, Mod 410 is fully reassembled. Pardon the wiring mess. Let's turn it on. An interesting thing that I noticed is that without the clocks running, it draws 193 milliamps, but as soon as I get those turned on, it drops to 180 milliamps. So on the scope, I'm way zoomed out. The second trace there is the external 4 pulse per second sync. So there's a couple of those on the screen. I still have wired up to input 10 on MCR1, channel 2 on the power supply here, and since that pin is mapped to all 10 cores in that MCR, when I turn that on we get the same thing we were seeing before, the output being replayed on all 10 output bits. And then I've also added bit 5 of MCR6. If I turn that on, you can see it show up right there, right on bit 5, in the middle of our sort of frame here. And, you know, it's doing its multiplexing job well. If I turn off MCR1, then all of those bits disappear and our MCR6 output remains, and I can do, you know, any combination of these. So everything appears to be working. Again, I haven't tested all of the MCRs, but the ones that I've tried have all worked, so I think that this is basically a fully working box. And that's going to do it for this restoration. Thank you all for watching. I'm going to have more like this in the future, so stay tuned, and I will see you then.